pilots keep pace with today's high-tech killing machines? Is more technology the answer for Top Gun and beyond?
Funding for NOVA's 20th anniversary season is made possible by Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership. And Johnson & Johnson, the signature recognized around the world for commitment to quality healthcare products for the entire family. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
This brave young man is about to have the oxygen supply to his brain temporarily turned off. His heart will falter. The doctors in attendance concede that it could even stop. And while all this is going on, he'll actually weigh over half a ton.
All right, I need your name and rank.
Name, Darren L. Petrie. Rank, Senior Airman.
Senior Airman Pete Petrie is a research volunteer at the Aeromedical Center at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. In this experiment, his body will be subject to 9 times the force of gravity in what must be the world's most grueling roller coaster ride, the centrifuge. Scientists here are seeking answers to questions of grave military concern. Can today's fighter pilots cope with the physical and psychological demands placed upon them in combat? Or have we designed a generation of fighters so technologically advanced that they push the pilot beyond the limits of human physiology?
Okay, Detroit, the base going turning south here. Roger, I'm going in, take off right.
Somehow the biology never got into the picture. They dealt with the technology of conquering the problems of flight. And the engineers who build airplanes today are still basically the same kind of person. They're solving physics problems, engineering problems, power thrust curve problems. They're not dealing with biology. And as a matter of fact, I think this is one of the definers of our current dilemma. We didn't have to up until this point in time. And now the technology has reached a point where it's not just that we're going to lose a pilot because the plane fails or something, but we're going to lose pilots because they can't operate the systems that are being presented to them.
Nowadays, when a fighter pilot climbs into the cockpit of a high-performance jet, he's charged with the awesome responsibility of operating some of the most complex machinery ever devised at speeds that would outstrip a rifle bullet. He will be pushed to the edge of his physical and intellectual limits, and tradition demands that he respond with the right stuff. But this image of the pilot, gleaned from the exploits of the aces of past wars, ignores the reality of aerial combat today. As these highly trained pilots know, their own human frailty may be more of a threat than the enemy in today's complex and powerful high-performance jets.
We believe that the pilot's workplace is perhaps the most demanding office in the world. Not only must the pilot attend to all the information that's presented on a myriad of controls and displays, he has to do this while being shot at, pulling G's, worrying about getting killed, or missing something that may be flying in from the ground or from another air threat. Also, he has to be concerned about where his friends are located, because he certainly doesn't want to shoot down one of the friendlies. So we feel that perhaps combining all of these things, that the fighter pilot's role is perhaps the most demanding one of any job in the world.
I see him loud and clear.
The speeds have increased, but the problem is that it doesn't have anything to do with the actual speed. It's the relative closure and how quick things happen. in World War II, possibly we could still see a formation of fighters 20 miles away, and traveling at 300 or 400 knots, we had a good bit of time to think about that. Now 20 miles away is only 30 seconds before I have to start doing something really important. In the past, when I saw an adversary, I immediately started thinking ahead, not how I can kill him now, but how I can maneuver through space, conserve my energy, and wind up in a position to employ the weapons. I don't have time for that anymore. I simply say, there he is. I look around quickly to see if I'm safe, pull the airplane toward him, employ the ordnance instantly, and get out of there. So, see him, kill him, and leave quickly.
That grim but simple motto, see him, kill him, and leave quickly, is in fact what fighter tactics have always been about. Today, there are 6,500 aircraft. That's 43% of all American naval and Air Force planes which qualify as fighters. But this aggregate figure obscures a wide variety of capabilities and technologies that reflect a continuing debate within the military. Should we invest in high-tech or low-tech warplanes? Do we buy a few highly capable but extremely expensive multi-role aircraft, or lots of cheaper single-purpose planes? And of course, that debate is fueled by intelligence estimates which indicate that the Soviet fighter force may outnumber ours by at least 2 to 1. Currently, the fighters in the U.S. Armed Services straddle the divide. This is the General Dynamics F-16. Short-range, lightweight, supremely agile, and at $16 million each, it's the Air Force's relatively cheap frontline dogfighter. The Navy's FA-18 is a bit bigger, considerably more expensive, and has a lot more roles to fulfill. But it's still essentially a hit-and-run fighter in the lightweight end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is a different sort of creature altogether. The F-14 is the staggeringly capable two-seat interceptor fighter for the Navy. Dubbed the first of the super fighters, the mammoth F-14 literally bristles with sophisticated and expensive radar and electronic warfare equipment.
There's a joke that goes around the industry that says that the airplanes of today are designed by PhDs, they're built by guys with master's degrees, they're flown by people with bachelor's degrees, and they're maintained by people with high school educations. And that's part of the problem, is that they're just too sophisticated.
The Navy justifies the whopping $43 million price tag for each plane by claiming that the F-14 can strike up to 6 targets at once over ranges in excess of 100 miles using its $1 million-a-shot Phoenix missiles. Sadly, that claim has yet to be proven, and the maintenance and reliability record of this super high-tech aircraft has yet to meet the targets set by the Navy 15 years ago. But from the pilot's point of view, it's the F-15 which is arguably the most complex of them all, because he alone commands the various engine, navigation, flight control, and weapon systems. His missions in this remarkable aircraft will range from intercepting long-range intruders, like this Soviet bomber known to NATO forces as the Bear, to tangling with adversaries in what's called the furball of a conventional dogfight. For many observers, the $39 million F-15 epitomizes technology's ability to combat by its quality the quantity of the Soviet threat. For other, less convinced commentators, it's a classic example of an almost religious belief in a technology that is in danger of overwhelming today's fighter pilot. In the F-15 cockpit, for example, there are 300 switches, 75 different displays, 11 switches on the control stick, and 9 switches on the throttle. Complexity on this mind-numbing scale would have been inconceivable to the pilots of the F-15's distant cousin, the tiny Fokker triplane, although both were designed to fulfill the same mission. 50 years of aeronautical development separate these two interceptor fighters. 50 years in which the quest for power, range, height, and speed has produced quite shattering performance. Aeronautical designers refer to what's known as an aircraft's flight envelope when talking about its performance. It's a pictorial representation of the limits of an aircraft's capabilities. And as we trace out the flight envelope of the F-15, the engineers can determine how slowly it can fly without falling out of the air, what its maximum altitude is, and how fast it will go, both in the thinner air of the upper atmosphere and in the denser air near the ground. It's taken half a century of aircraft development to create a flight envelope this large. And by comparison, the triplane's envelope seems absurdly limited. In today's terms, that limited capability seems almost comical. But in fact, when the triplane first went into service with Manfred von Richthofen's Flying Circus, so called because of the garish colors they used to identify each other in the melee of a dogfight, it was a resounding success. Its 3 wings generated a lot of lift, enabling it to climb higher and faster than many of its enemies. In combination with a large single-piece rudder, a short fuselage, and plenty of power, that lift also meant that the tiny triplane was a very maneuverable and effective fighter aircraft.
Actually, these aircraft were as modern in 1917 as an F-14 would be today. They were state-of-the-art, and the engineers knew quite a bit about airplane design. Some of the problems they ran into was that they lacked a lot of things that we now consider essential. For example, they had no brakes, they had no oxygen system, they had no radios, they had no pressurization, and of course they had no parachutes.
Well, just made you think about you're up there off the ground, and you sure couldn't step out and save yourself if anything happened. You just had to be brave and sit up there and ride it out. Wasn't a damn thing you could do about it. You didn't like it, you didn't have to like it.
Bob Todd was barely 20 when he shot down his first Fokker triplane in May of 1917. Within 3 hectic weeks after claiming 4 further kills, he became officially one of America's first aces. He was later shot down himself and spent the rest of the war in a German prison. In a sense, he was lucky, because the horrifyingly short life expectancy of a World War I fighter pilot was a chillingly brief 17 hours in the air. Just 3 short years before Bob Todd's exploits as World War I started, sporting planes were being used only for reconnaissance. But as pilots began to take their pistols and rifles up with them, they spawned a new and deadly art form, dogfighting. Before long, as new designs of airplanes were entering the fray almost every month, the tricks of aerial combat were being learned and practiced. The objective was always a brutally simple one. Maneuver into position behind your adversary and then pump bullets into his aircraft until you hit something vital, a main spar, the engine, or him. The skill, of course, lay in the techniques of turning the tables on an enemy that was behind you and maneuvering into position behind him. There was nothing chivalrous or gallant about this endeavor. It was a matter of kill or be killed. But, as has been characteristic of the decision-making surrounding fighter design throughout this century, the conflicting qualities of speed and maneuverability were fundamentally misunderstood.
Well, when airplanes first started fighting each other seriously, the designers thought that the key element of the fight was maneuverability. And so for most of World War I, they designed aircraft with multiple wings so that the aircraft would get a lot of lift and would be able to turn very rapidly. It also had the advantage of that the aircraft would be more secure and that you could wire the wings together. Had they looked at their own data, however, they would have found out that most of the kills, in fact 80% of all kills in World War I, were actually when one plane made a single pass at another and hit the pilot before he ever knew what was happening, and then would just fly away. But they did not know this, and so they kind of went down a false road, if you will, and they designed two-wing airplanes. They even designed three-wing airplanes in 1917. This concept had a life that went on through the 20s, but by the 30s, we knew that the single-wing airplane, being faster, was a much better killing machine.
When Adolf Hitler lit the fuse of World War II in September '39, Britain had only 12 squadrons, a scant 187 of the now legendary Spitfires. Along with the Hawker Hurricane, their mettle was tested in the summer of 1940 in what was to become known as the Battle of Britain. High above Kent, the so-called Garden of England, the Spitfire was proving that it was both quick and agile. Like the Fokker triplane and the F-15, it was a classic fighter interceptor. But as the experiences of the previous World War might have indicated, of the two qualities in a fighter, speed proved more important than agility, and the race for power began to dominate the design of these killing machines. But even as the propeller-driven fighters were carving their gruesome niche in history, the technology that was to supersede them was being secretly developed. The Messerschmitt 262 was Germany's first fully operational jet fighter. Along with its contemporary, the British Meteor, the first jet flights in 1942 and 3 were secretly ringing the death knell for propeller-driven aircraft. But by the time this brilliant technology entered either the Royal Air Force or the Luftwaffe, the war was as good as lost for the Nazis. The German Messerschmitt 262 did enter the fray briefly, however, in late 1944, and the effect on the Allied fighter pilots who saw this new aeronautical miracle was
religious. Holy Moses, look at that! Very religious. We knew we'd been given a clue they were coming. And, but when we first saw them, it was kind of unbelievable, their speed and their agility. The only way we battled them was to try to get in their way. Fortunately, Hitler was an idiot. He didn't use them properly at all.
The 262 ended its combat days as a ground attack bomber, rather than as the high-speed interceptor that it clearly was. But by its invention, the jet had brought other revolutions. The high-tech 262 was frankly a major headache as far as endurance, maintainability, and reliability were concerned. And for the pilot, the new complexities of jet engine control and management meant that the cockpit was now an unfamiliar nightmare of switches and dials. But there's a saying in fighter aviation that speed is life. And with a top speed of 540 miles per hour, the extra 100 miles an hour that this aircraft gained over its closest prop-driven rivals was too seductive to ignore.
After the war, we had air forces such as the Soviet Air Force and the Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force, the United States Army Air Forces, that had come through the war with thousands of airplanes. But after the war, those air forces were obsolescent. Immediately, the jet had rendered them so. The jet promised a whole new era of air combat, of engagements at high speed, at the ability to undertake slashing attacks and what we term blow-through attacks that were simply unavailable to the era of propeller-driven airplanes, the ability to make repetitive attacks, and all these very much took time to get used to. Basically, during the post-war periods following any war, we have always seen cries that the era of dogfighting is over, the era of dogfighting is past. And people said the same thing when the jet came along. Well, now we're flying too fast. We obviously won't have dogfighting in the traditional sense, just like they had said about the monoplane in the 1930s.
Back in 1947, when I started flying F-80s, we were initially given the idea that this airplane was too fast, and that now that you were out of P-47s and that you were into jets, you wouldn't have to, you're not going to worry about that anymore because dogfighting is at an end. The speeds are too great and all that sort of thing. Turns are too wide with the great speeds and that. Well, we didn't know all that, so we just kept right on dogfighting with the airplanes, and it was a fine dogfighter.
Of course, that training was soon to be put to the test as the war clouds gathered again, this time in Korea. And perhaps inevitably, a new classic fighter rose to the occasion. A direct descendant of the triplane and the Spitfire. The F-86 Sabre was the first swept-wing jet fighter in the West, and its speed and maneuverability won many converts and many battles. But back in Washington, the quest for the first supersonic fighter was echoing through the labyrinths of the Pentagon. Before long, maneuverability was again discarded in favor of the holy grail of power and speed, and again the art of dogfighting was out of fashion. In 1953, the McDonnell Aircraft Company initiated a program which offered a twin-engine supersonic multi-role aircraft. And when in 1956, the F-4 Phantom was finally accepted, the strategists and tacticians were so convinced that conventional air-to-air combat was now a thing of the past that they even left a gun out of the design, believing that missiles would satisfy the requirements of any future air war. But not everyone was convinced that even in a high-tech aircraft such as this, that was a wise idea.
I was told in the Pentagon by my boss, who was a two-star general, in the, when was it, 1963. He said, Olds, go back to your desk and stop coming up with all of these studies proving that we don't have a conventional capability of the United States Air Force. You've got to get it through your head that we're not going to fight conventional wars anymore. He said, you're living in the past with your leather, you think you've got your leather flight jacket on and your white scarf and your goggles and leather helmet, and you're going to go out and do mortal air-to-air combat with the enemy. That's finished. We'll never do that again. So about 4 years later, I was going up the Gulf of Tonkin in this airplane. Got a nice kid in the back seat named Steve Croker. I said, Stevie, baby, look at all this that's going on around us right now. All those tankers and the thuds over there. And you were going to go up and drop iron bombs on the railroad and probably hassle with MiGs, but I want you not to worry about it because I have it on good authority that this is not happening.
Okay, we're getting close to the turn point. Roger, I'm turning right now.
Of course it was happening, fast and furiously.
South there. Roger, I'm going to break off right. I see him loud and clear.
But now, in addition to the historical inevitability of close-quarter dogfighting, fighter pilots were coping with a deluge of radar and radio inputs, as well as being faced with surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, which would wriggle up from the jungle at over the speed of sound and explode within feet of your aircraft. Even for many experienced pilots, it all became just too much.
There were a lot of things going on. Our radar warning equipment was giving us warning that the missiles were being launched against us. We didn't know whether that was true or false. I had intelligence coming from an agency in real time. They were telling me that MiGs were coming up behind us and were going to attack. We had ground control from a carrier out in the Tonkin Gulf telling us where the MiGs were approximately relative to us. We were listening to the people that we were escorting. There were other people that were suppressing the anti-aircraft artillery and the SAMs, all on the same frequency or on various frequencies that we were listening to. I could hear the growl from my air-to-air missiles. The heat seekers have a distinctive sound that you hear in the headset when you have them selected. And of course, all the noise from the radar warning equipment. As it happened, the MiG came up behind me, and my wingman saw him and tried to warn me of the MiG. And I never heard the warning. I saw a missile go by, presumably his first shot with which he missed, and tried to turn out of the way, Luckily, I did turn out of the way. The second shot only damaged my airplane slightly, and I was able to bring the airplane back. But I never heard my wingman calling me, trying to tell me there was a MiG behind me. When I got back, I listened to the tape of the mission, and clear as day, he had told me that the MiG was there and what I should do to avoid the attack. I didn't hear it. I was totally saturated.
Despite all the efforts at human engineering to consider all the variables, there's still just too much. And you hear stories about pilots given the option who turn the equipment off and fly by the seat of their pants because they're just overloaded.
Going in across the Red River in this very old airplane, we had a procedure where we started turning off things like this. Well, it's not here anymore, but there was a detection gear for the SAMs. It made noises. It bothered you. It didn't tell you the right information in the first place, because if you relied on this, the SAM was going to hit you. You avoided SAMs in an entirely different way. You had to see them. This would warn you if one was coming up from behind, and then you do something different. But we turned that off. We turned off guard channel, because there's always somebody screaming on the emergency channel. We turned off the growl on the sidewinders. I'd usually put the kid in the back seat on cold bike so I couldn't hear him. He could hear me. That's what I wanted. And I turned off all the noise I could so that I could then concentrate on the battle at hand.
General Olds had been an Air Force ace in World War II, but the statistics in either the Air Force or the Navy were not proving to be very encouraging. Too many pilots were not coming back, and nobody was quite sure why. The Navy decided to do something about it.
Well, way back in World War II and Korea, the Navy was achieving a kill ratio of about 10 to 1. Every time we got rid of 10 bad guys, they got one of us, which is a good kill ratio. Early on in Vietnam, in the early 60s, if you took a look at the kill ratio there for the Navy, it was a 2 to 2.5 to 1, which is unacceptable. An individual by the name of Captain Frank Alt put out a report called the Alt Report that identified numerous deficiencies at that point in time. Out of that came some initiatives. One of them was the development of a school that had instructors that were highly versed in threat tactics and flew aircraft that simulated the threat that our fighters were encountering in Vietnam. That school became known as Top Gun.
Pressing on in, good dot in the diamond. VID, looks like a MiG-21. All of a sudden we find ourselves beak to beak with this guy.
Well, as these students returned to the fleet or returned to their squadrons and went back into the Vietnam era, that year, 1972, the Navy's air-to-air kill ratio went up to almost 13 to 1.
Against a bogey like this, who do you think is going to have the toughest time?
One of the first graduates of Top Gun was the Navy's first ace, Randy Cunningham.
On 10 May 1972, after I'd already shot down 2 airplanes, on the way out to sea, I met a MiG-17, which I didn't know was a MiG-17 at first. I saw a dot coming at me head on. As I approached the MiG, his wing roots lit up with his 23 and 37 millimeter cannon, and the tracers started coming by, and I went, man, he's got a gun in his nose. It surprised me, so I went pure vertical. Now, in most fights, the pilots had been easy, so this was just about the time you think, well, a white scarf, it's time to put out the Benson and Hedges. I'll pull the airplane back over in the vertical, and I'll watch him heading for Hanoi, come back around and shoot him. That was just about the temperament that was going on inside my mind and inside my guts, okay? But as I came back over the top, straining over the back of the ejection seat to see him running, instead what he did is went into the pure vertical with me, and we were going canopy to canopy, maybe 50 to 75 feet apart. I could look in and see a little set of Gomer goggles, a little Gomer scarf, and a little Gomer mic that he was using. Well, as I went up into the vertical, I had more thrust, okay? It still didn't dawn on me that I knew he surprised me, but I didn't know who this was yet, and I didn't know what his capabilities were.
Unfortunately for Commander Cunningham, he'd crossed swords with the legendary North Vietnamese double ace, Colonel Toon, who had no less than 13 American kills to his credit. The aerial combat that followed has since come to be regarded as one of the longest and most complex dogfights in aviation history. Each pilot flew his plane to the very edge of its flight envelope as the battle careened across the Asian skies. The tiny, quick-turning MiG against the heavy but more powerful Phantom. Attack and counterattack, engagement and disengagement, like a huge and deadly 3D chess game. But just when it began to seem as if the fight would last forever, Colonel Toon made his first and last mistake. For the briefest of moments, the outwitted Vietnamese ace was vulnerable.
Every emotion you've ever felt in your life, love, hate, fear, pain, anger, magnify it 1,000 times. And that's the feeling that you go through. It's emotionally and physically draining. You know that one of you, when you engage, is not going to come back. When you know that you have survived that, it's almost like being reborn.
It's a fast, harsh, gut-wrenching battle in a huge arena, very quick. I've seen the sky full of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts in 1 second. 5 seconds, 10 seconds later, they're all gone. There's not a plane to be seen anywhere except the one you're behind, or it might be behind you. Modern combat is the same. Sometimes a battle will last a little longer because of the circumstance. Your position, his position, where you are, what you're doing. Mostly it's over in a matter of seconds.
You have to know the absolute limit of your physical being and of your machine. And the idea is that you ride on the perfect edge, the balance of disaster and the balance of winning.
Commander Cunningham later went on to become an instructor at the Top Gun school that had taught him so well. The philosophy behind Top Gun and its Air Force equivalent Red Flag is to teach pilots how to fight a wide range of potential adversaries. Not surprisingly, each of the aircraft on this busy flight line emulates the capabilities of a different Soviet fighter. The Top Gun motto is, fight like you train and train like you fight. But one of the ironies of Top Gun's success is that the instructors flying low-technology A4 and F5 aircraft day in and day out are beating, or to use the jargon, waxing the students in the high-tech F-14s with embarrassing regularity. Indeed, as the Red Baron is reported to have said, it's not the crate, but the man sitting in it that counts. For many, the lesson is a simple one. Invest in lots of pilots and invest in training them in lots of lower-tech aircraft. This message has been acknowledged by the Pentagon, but not yet adopted by the admirals and generals who, it seems, would rather their fighter pilots be equipped with the best machines that money can buy.
Here's what happens. You have an airplane that's very sophisticated, costs a lot of money. Therefore, you can't build very many of them because we do have a fixed budget. Every year it's fixed. So we say, well, we can procure X number of airplanes. Well, if we can only have that number, then we've got to have the very best money can buy because Americans have always been willing to trade treasure for blood. So we're going to make that a very sophisticated airplane, and we're going to give that guy the capability to do everything. It's going to be able to get all kinds of information, and he's going to be able to do all kinds of things with it. As a result, because we can't have as many airplanes, we have to give it more capability, so he has to do more, the pilot has to do more, and as a result, he gets overloaded, and in my opinion, is going to get shot down while he's trying to figure out what he's doing.
Nowadays, that logic also confronts the pilot with his own physical limitations. Turning corners in an airplane at speed produces G's, the forces that mimic gravity. G-forces have been a factor in aerial combat since World War I. But today's fighters are so fast and so maneuverable that the high G's they inflict on the pilot's body and brain can seriously impair his flying ability. Commander Charles Heater Heatley describes the sensation of G's.
It feels like a great weight pressing down on you. The more you pull back on the stick, the harder it presses down. And what you feel is the oxygen mask pressing on your nose. You feel the skin coming down on your face. Sweat from your brow just seems to come down in currents in front of your eyes. As soon as it pops out of your forehead, it goes straight down in front of your eyes. And you can feel your lungs being pressed on your diaphragm, and you just sort of scrunch into the seat. And in fact, I notice after a first couple turns in an ACM engagement, I can raise my seat a little bit and get a little more height in the cockpit. because what was normal is now a couple inches less than normal.
But there is far more to G's than discomfort or being able to change your seating position. With the power available to today's fighter pilot, he can turn and turn until he runs out of gas, and sustaining high G's for more than a second or two brings other less welcome physiological effects.
You start to see dots out here, and it starts to close in, and color goes away. So when things start turning into black and white, you start letting loose of the stick. And if you keep pulling, you get what's called tunnel vision. You can only see an area about this big. And if you continue to pull, everything goes black. And when it goes black, you can still hear the radio, you still know you're flying, you still know you're in an airplane, and it is now time to unload and get the blood back in your head. If you don't get back off the stick, pretty soon, not only will you lose your vision, you'll lose consciousness, and then you have G-induced loss of consciousness.
If it were possible to see inside a pilot's brain when he is subject to high Gs, we would see that the principal problem was one of oxygen starvation. Like other cells in his body, brain cells need oxygen. Oxygen-rich blood is pumped by the heart into the exquisitely fine circuitry of the cerebrovascular system. But when exposed to high Gs, that blood begins to weigh more. At about 4 or 5 times the force of gravity, the heart's pumping action ceases to be effective, and the blood pressure in the head falls to 0. This denies the brain cells the oxygen that's vital to their continued activity. And within 3 seconds, they stop functioning and the pilot lapses into unconsciousness.
The big problem is that most people, especially in single-seat fighters, don't know they've had the event. They just feel a little bit dizzy or whatever. Nowadays, the F-16, which is behind me, and the F-15 and others have videotapes, and it records the whole flight out there. So now, because the information is better, even though you're in a single-seat fighter, we can play the videos back and say, holy cow, I was asleep during this period of time.
For the video you're about to see, holy cow would be an understatement. Were it not for the fact that this recording, specially cleared for NOVA, was acquired during a training mission in a 2-seater aircraft, the following sequence, the aircraft it was recorded in, and the pilot flying the plane, would not be around today. In this first frame of the recording, we see the New Mexico desert from a height of 24,000 feet, shown on the right vertical scale. The speed is displayed on the left vertical and shows 420 knots. The G rating is displayed as a figure at the top of the left-hand scale. For the moment, while the plane is in a gentle left-hand turn, it reads 1.2 G. The air combat instructor, sitting in the back seat, identifies an intruding aircraft at right 130. The pilot commences a fast, hard pull further to the left. It's a 7G pull, and it hurts. That last groan has since been analyzed as the moment when the student pilot lost consciousness. But the instructor in the back seat doesn't know that yet. All he sees is the desert floor rushing towards him. He decides to call the pilot's attention to the fact. The G reading is now back to normal, around 1 G, and the pilot is recovering, but not quickly enough. The cool instructor offers some more advice.
Altitude, recover.
The plane is now doing nearly 500 knots straight down towards the sun-baked rocks below. Realizing at last what's happened, the instructor pulls the aircraft out of its lethal dive and finds time to give vent to his feelings.
Damn it!
It's now estimated that over 20 pilots have died in the last 5 years as a result of accidents due to losing consciousness under the excessive G forces of the new super agile fighters. Here at Brooks Air Force Base, a comprehensive research program is being conducted in the centrifuge to establish the exact nature of the way the body responds to Gs and the full extent of the pilot's incapacitation. What they've discovered is that many of today's fighters can subject the pilot to up to 9 or 10 times the force of gravity so quickly that the usual experiences of graying out and tunnel vision are effectively bypassed, and he will fade straight into unconsciousness. But a further sinister sting in the tail of G loss of consciousness is that if he's lucky enough to wake up at all, its effects are by no means over.
When you have a loss of consciousness, basically the blood pressure in the brain goes to 0, and after a few seconds, it basically takes a nap. And you go through this, what we call an absolute incapacitation period of time. During this time, your mind is elsewhere. It's in a dreamlike world. You could be on the planet Mars or whatever. As the blood gets back into the brain and all those centers start working again, you start waking up and you realize that you are again a human being, that you're in an airplane. In fact, you're piloting, and all of a sudden you look out in front and there are some trees in front of you and pull on the stick and you save your life. Now, in peacetime, for a military pilot, that's about all he really needs, because the only real threat out there is hitting the ground. The problem is, for military aviation, is the wartime consequences of a GLC. Not only do you go through the 12 seconds of absolute incapacitation and then this 12 seconds of waking up into this dreamlike state, the problem is your higher learning centers, your cognitive skills, the skills that we as fighter pilots learn, that's flying, dogfighting and dropping bombs, they don't start working for at least 2 minutes, and sometimes as long as 4 minutes. In the air-to-air business, which I'm most familiar with, it can be very serious. Because you can imagine you're flying along in a 2-ship package out there, and your wingman looks over his shoulder and sees an attacking aircraft. So immediately calls the section or the 2-ship to brake, let's say in this case a right turn. So immediately you go into a hard right turn, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Gs, whatever's required. And if your attention is over your shoulder, looking back, trying to find the guy that's trying to kill you out there, in about 5 or 6 seconds, if you're not doing anything to elevate your pressure upstairs, you're going to be taking a nap. And what happens there then, instead of pulling 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Gs where required, the aircraft eases off, and now you become a 1 G strafe target, and the guy can just go right in there and literally gun your brains out, and you're going to die.
Traditionally, the inappropriately named G suit, which is actually an inflatable corset with legs, has offered some measure of support to the pilot by squeezing his legs and stomach to prevent his blood from pooling in his feet. But even at their best, these suits only offer an extra G or so of enhanced tolerance. And in the viciously maneuverable F-16, that just isn't enough. In the face of this awesome power, and for the first time ever in fighter aviation, pilots assigned to F-16 squadrons are now required to be G-rated in the centrifuge and are taught what is known as the energy straining maneuver.
The subject is ready to brake. Brake is activated. Pressure.
Pilots and doctors alike coyly describe this exercise as exactly like straining on the toilet when you're constipated. This may be faintly embarrassing, acutely uncomfortable, and when performed on the ground at 1 G, very dangerous. But in high G maneuvers, it can win an extra 3 Gs of tolerance for the pilot.
Our whole purpose is to give them the confidence and the knowledge that they can operate at the higher G levels without taking a nap and maybe having a bad day.
Hello.
Hello.
I repeat.
Hello.
In an effort to further reduce the stresses on the pilot, this highly computerized version of the F-16 can actually talk.
Brake, fuel, 5.6 pounds.
Advisory altitude.
The principal objective, of course, is to present the pilot with auditory information, which previously had to be read from a dial or a display. But a secondary benefit relates to G-induced loss of consciousness. If the plane believes that the pilot is diving too quickly towards the ground, it will tell him so. And if he ignores the warning or can't hear it because he's unconscious, the plane will take over and fly him to safety. Although there are myriad displays and dials which tell the pilot about the status of the aircraft, until now there's been nothing to tell the aircraft about the status of the pilot. This study, being conducted by doctors at Edwards Air Force Base in California, monitors the pilot's brain waves while he's flying so that eventually the plane will be able to judge whether the guy at the controls is awake, asleep, or somewhere in between.
And that goes right to the equipment.
The key to the system is a dynamic analysis of the different types of brain waves associated with different types of activities.
Captain Escherman, would you please gently grit your teeth for me? That's fine. Now relax your jaw. All right, now could you please close your eyes for us?
It's these longer, more regular alpha rhythms associated with a state of relaxed vigilance which are of particular interest to the doctors running the study. For 3 years, test pilots have subjected themselves and their aircraft to every stressful maneuver in the book, while having their brain waves recorded for subsequent analysis back in the laboratory. The study has amassed a wealth of data which will be published this year. But already there have been some interesting and unexpected themes emerging, not just concerning the brain's experience of G's, but also concerning that other potential killer, information overload. It turns out that fighter pilots are predominantly artists, because flying planes is a function of the right side of the brain. The left side of the brain is the administrator, checking data, establishing priorities. From time to time, the two halves check with each other that all is going well. But problems occur when that cross-checking starts occurring too often, when the brain can't decide who's in control. Combined with the physical effects of G's, this psychological overload amounts to a serious problem for today's pilots, a problem some scientists have called the biology barrier.
Perhaps even more profound in some ways than the sound barrier. We could come up with technology to resolve that problem and go far beyond it. But now we have to redesign the operator. And the decision is, do we maintain a biological operator or a silicon-based operator?
Or perhaps even both. Here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, engineers are working on developing smart systems that will relieve the pilot of the routine chores of flying. New cockpit layouts will present him with pre-digested information that is designed to assist him in developing what's known as situational awareness. The displays enable him to keep track of how his aircraft is performing, and should a problem occur, the aircraft will tell him about it.
Caution, fuel.
Fix it.
If only everything were that simple.
Fix the fuel. Okay. Max range?
340 miles.
This system is known as the magic cockpit. And in addition to chatting amiably in a female voice, because female voices apparently command attention better than male voices, it will show him plan views of his target and simulated 3D perspective views of his run-in. But there are some cockpit designers who'd like to go even further and abolish conventional displays altogether.
Humans are basically three-dimensional beings. We see things in 3 dimensions, we hear things in 3 dimensions, and we touch things in 3 dimensions. And what we want to try to do now is to take those things that the pilot needs to know and convey them to him in a wide field of view, 3-dimensional picture with 3-dimensional sound and 3-dimensional things that he can touch, all of which are synthesized in the computer and projected into 3-dimensional space for the pilot.
And inside what must be the zaniest helmet ever devised, this is what the pilot sees. Like some fantastic arcade game of the future, the pilot flies through a world that the computer has devised for him, based upon the known characteristics of the F-15 and its potential adversaries. In this Tron-like 3D arena, he can take off and land, navigate to preset coordinates, and he can fire his guns if need be, there is still a gun, and activate his missiles, all by voice control.
Selected.
The engineers readily admit that these futuristic concepts are likely to remain impractical for at least the next 8 to 10 years, And clearly, no pilot could be persuaded to dogfight pulling G's with a ridiculous contraption like this on his head. But it is only experimental, and advances in miniaturizing the high-resolution TV screens that will project the graphic displays onto the inside of the visor have already led to the development of a new and much more feasible flying helmet currently under test. But even more unusual ideas are being developed at Wright-Patterson. This man is switching switches simply by looking at them. Using infrared lasers, sensors in his helmet read his eye position from moment to moment so that computers can identify the switch he's looking at. And down the corridor, the tiny magnetic fields given off by the brain activity of this research volunteer are being analyzed by a superconducting device known simply as SQUID. Controlling fighter aircraft systems simply by thinking is, some researchers claim, no more than 30 years away. But if technology is making such giant strides forward, why push human pilots beyond their limits? Why risk human flesh and blood in cockpits at all?
If we were able to know everything that was going to go on in a battle, if we knew where the enemy was going to be, we knew where our friendlies were going to be, if we knew how well our aircraft was going to work, how well our weapons were going to work, it wouldn't be necessary to put a pilot in the loop because we can program a computer or a drone to go do that work. But that's not what happens in the battle. The whole battle situation engenders a sense of uncertainty. Therefore, you have to have an element in that system that can adapt, can adjust, to be able to compensate for the deficiencies of the system or perhaps some of the gaming that the enemy does. Therefore, we believe that for a long time, we're going to have a human in the loop.
Even Star Wars had a pilot in the cockpit. But air combat maneuvering is so dynamic. The human element brings flexibility that I think will actually be the key to success out there, because there's just no substitute for being on the spot, in the air, seeing who's injured, who's not damaged, who's in trouble, who's not in trouble. There's all sorts of things that the pilot can do at the scene that someone far away from the scene, remotely flying it or computer-controlled airplane, will never, ever be able to figure out.
Consequently, you still need to train to the basics of dogfighting that probably haven't changed since the days of World War I. A barrel roll is still a barrel roll, and a immelman still an immelman. We still do flat and rolling scissors, and we still need a gun on the aircraft to be able to shoot that guy when he's 500 feet out in front of us, which is well within the minimum ranges of all of our sophisticated missiles. But it's certainly not within the minimum range of a bullet.
Which brings us right back to where it all started. Here at Top Gun, the cream of the Navy's fighter pilots learn how to employ World War I tactics with 21st century technology against numerous but essentially low-tech foes. For years, the comment attributed to Lenin that quantity has a quality all its own seemed to be driving the design of Soviet fighters. But recently, all that seems to have been changing.
Right now, we're looking at a much more capable airplane. In this case, anyone know what this is?
MiG-29?
Exactly right. MiG-29 Fulcrum. Much more capable airplane in terms of all those performance factors we talked about earlier on.
The MiG-29 Fulcrum and its equally high-tech comrades, the Su-27 and the MiG-31, are high-performance 21st century fighters. Some say they're equal in sophistication to the F-15 and the F-14. And certainly their electronic capabilities are being viewed with envy in the West. As the Soviets move from low-tech quantity towards disquietingly better quality, the West agonizes over whether or not to shift its emphasis the other way, from technological quality towards more quantity. So where does all this leave the pilot, the guy at the sharp end? What he seems to need is reliable and appropriate machines, not necessarily the most expensive ones, that will enable him to get on with the job we're asking him to do. While there are many opinions about how to equip the squadrons of tomorrow, one thing is clear. we can no longer continue to ignore the intrinsic limits of human physiology and psychology. Technology has brought these highly educated, highly trained pilots face to face with what has been referred to in this program as the biology barrier. If pilots are to remain in the cockpit at all in the future, technology will have to find a way to overcome that barrier as well.
Tomorrow night at 8, it's a spectacular 3-hour nature special that explores South America's wondrous wildlife. Don't miss Flight of the Condor, tomorrow beginning at 8 on Vermont ETV. And now stay tuned to Vermont ETV for Sea Power, a global journey, next.